Thank you for joining me for this video on equity versus equality. This is now week 3, and we've made it to the topic of equity. We wanted to kind of delve in a little bit deeper. So let me share my screen with you. We actually are going to be using the United Way Equity Framework. I don't know any other way to talk about an equity framework. I'm not very good at talking about it in theoretical terms, but I do want to be able to use a case example of the United Way and how they include and how they incorporate an equity type of framework within their organization. So the title of United Way's equity framework is Strengthening Our Equity Muscle to Accelerate Impact. One of the things that the equity framework with United Way does is that it explains the difference, or it has its own definition of equity. I wanted to include this graphic. United Way has a portion of this graphic within the document that's uploaded in Moodle, but I wanted to just illustrate the difference between equality and equity. So if you notice on the far left, you have the graphic where in reality, you have individuals or groups that get more than what is needed in order to have the impact of seeing the game, or even being able to see the game and engage with whatever type of situation that is desired. So one gets more than is needed while the other gets less than is needed. Thus a huge disparity is then created. Equality, the assumption that everyone benefits from the same supports. And in this graphic, you notice that everyone does not benefit from just giving everyone the same resources. This is considered to be equal treatment. Equity is when everyone gets the supports that they need and it produces the equity or equitable outcomes, such as what you see in this graphic. And then you have individuals and organizations that will even take it a step further, where you would just remove the fence altogether. All three can see the game without supports or accommodations because the causes of the inequity was addressed and the systemic barrier has now been removed. United Way also has, they have developed a vision. Part of the equity framework is to establish a vision for how will equity look within an organization or within an effort. And they have established a vision that goes like this. We recognize structural racism and other forms of oppression have contributed to persistent disparities, which United Way seeks to dismantle. Our United Way network strives to engage community members, especially those whose voices have traditionally been marginalized. We work with residents and public and private partners to co-create solutions that ensure everyone has the resources, support, opportunities, and networks they need to thrive. We commit to leveraging all of our assets, convening, strategic investments, awareness building, advocacy to create more equitable communities. Also a part of their framework is the establishment of goals. So United Way wants to be able to achieve by 2028, 5 million people obtaining better jobs. So that's in the category of economic mobility. Their second goal is in the area of education. 95% of students will graduate from high school ready for college or a career. And their final goal is within the health domain. 90% of people will be healthier. That's what they want to see by 2028. Also within their equity framework is the case for support, or the case for adopting the equity lens. And the best way to do this is to review the data. I want you to read through this yourself, but I just want to bring to our attention just a few data points within each of the three domains listed in their goals. So the first one is related to healthcare insurance and the disparities that are there. 11% of African Americans and 16% of Hispanics are uninsured. And in contrast, you have 6% of white Americans and 7% of Asian Americans who are insured. And United Way is looking at addressing this particular health disparity. The next case for the equity lens within their domain of education is we can look at reading proficiency. 18% of African American, 19% of American Indian, and 23% of Hispanic fourth grade students are proficient or above in reading. In contrast, you have 45% of white and 57% of Asian American fourth grade students that are proficient in reading. Here we have an educational disparity that United Way wants to direct resources to address. And finally, in the area of economic mobility, I apologize. It says review of the education data. It should be economic mobility. When you're looking at the poverty numbers, they found, and I'm pretty sure that they use US Census data, 21% of African Americans and 18% of Hispanic Americans live below the poverty line, in contrast to 10% of white and Asian Americans. So the big question is how? So the best way that I can help us wrap our heads around this portion of the framework is by saying, congratulations, you have been selected to participate on an equity and inclusion committee or a task force. And you are going to have the opportunity to sign up for a committee. So when you look at this graphic, I want you to look at each of these 6 equity levers as a committee. So you have the community mobilization committee, you have the communications committee, fundraising committee, capacity building committee, policy and advocacy, and finally, the data committee. Each of these committees their roles have been very well defined. So let's take the fundraising committee and look at how what the role of the fundraising committee will be. This lever focuses on, or this committee focuses on how United Ways can advance equity through fundraising, grant making, and resource allocation. So think about what committee you would be interested in now that you have been selected to be on the Equity and Inclusion Task Force. You might be interested in seeking out the data. You might be interested in the communications piece and the messaging, or you might be more interested in advocacy and policy. So think about, and you, in our assignment this week, you will be able to select a committee. So within this framework, it allows you to choose your journey. Here, I'm actually saying you will choose a committee to serve on. And so, for example, you've chosen the fundraising and resource allocation committee in order to address the education domain. Let's look at where do we actually begin. So within the equity framework that United Way is using, they start with assessment tools. And I actually want to be able to show you what some of those assessment tools look like. So there are some general equity questions that are asked, and notice that your committee or your equity task force group will be able to each have this form, and they will be able to rank to what extent or where do they fall. So for example, Our United Way has established specific goals that drive more equitable outcomes for our community. An example of that is close the proficiency gap in third grade reading between students by 10 percentage points by the year 2025. And so then you would put an X on one of these squares to say to what extent, how are we doing? So we might not have done anything to move the needle. So you would actually assign the number 1, and that would be your perception. Someone else might see that there are efforts being put in place to address reading proficiency, and they might assign the number 4. So that's how this particular form would work. So general equity questions will be asked and based off of whatever committee. So within the equity framework document that I just showed you, they have general equity questions, and then they have specific equity questions that are related specifically to your committee. And it's found on pages 106 through 109. And you have the opportunity to select what type of questions you feel as though are top priority. All of them are important, but you will select 2 within your assignment, and two of the top general equity questions, and at least 1 specific equity question specific to your committee. So we already went over one of the general equity questions that I selected for the fundraising committee. And here's the second. To what extent has United Way incorporated the needs of diverse communities that we serve as part of goal setting, as part of our priorities, impact strategies, and impact products? So I wanted to show you briefly what a specific, one of these specific equity questions look like. Let's go back to the document that you will be viewing. So let me scroll down just briefly. Notice there's a form for each and every committee. And I'm going to go down to fundraising. Okay, here we go. So on my committee, fundraising, these are the types of questions that are being asked, and everybody on the committee that hypothetically you are on, are being asked to rank and to rate to what extent do we do well or not do well on these measures. So for example, are United Way priorities advancing equity in the weighing of our grant making, resource allocation, and partnership decisions? I, as a committee member, would rank, well, we sometimes do this, but we could do better to get to number 5. So that's an example. But you might choose communications, or you might choose data, and you will choose the corresponding form to select at least one of these particular survey items to add to your assignment. Sometimes when you're serving on a task force or a coalition that is in the process of affecting change, it's very difficult to know where to begin. We've already established that you begin with some sort of assessment where you're kind of ranking and rating to what extent, how are we doing on a specific set of measures. But also you want to get to a discussion phase with your committee. You'll eventually get there if you're serving on a task force. So you'll get into discussions, and for the purposes of the United Way, they have developed some, and it's a very good model that they've incorporated within their framework that allows for committees to be able to initiate certain discussions. and even more specifically related to your committee. And that starts on page 16. So let me show you what that actually looks like. It's going to be found in Appendix B. And notice, say for instance, you've chosen the data committee because you're interested in health disparities or economic mobility or educational disparities. You will go down and look at, okay, what are some key questions we should be asking before while we're preparing to collect community data. So in your assignment, you will select at least 2 questions. So you might decide, okay, yeah, we want to know, what problem are we trying to solve? And then you might also say, okay, we definitely want to answer the question and have discussion around what are the barriers to gathering the needed data. For example, geography, language, historic relationships. So you will add that to your assignment. If you have selected community engagement and mobilization, you will look at, okay, well, what are some key questions we should be asking prior to engaging the community? So number one, it might be, what is our plan to ensure diverse perspectives are represented in our process? So again, I have elected to be on the fundraising committee. And one of the questions that I chose from that source document that I just showed you is, how have we engaged and leveraged our board members to advocate for equity with key constituencies and to set the tone within the organization? What has and has not worked? So the reason why this is important is because leadership starts from the top with our board members, and to what extent are they even bought in to this idea of using the equity lens? And then secondly, the second discussion question that I feel as though my fundraising committee should be asking is, how well do our existing donors understand the importance of increasing and maintaining our United Way's focus on equity? So our donors and our board members should have a level of buy-in, and there's a way to even rank that within those within the framework and the forms that United Way has provided. So then you'll come to a phase within your committee where you're looking at, okay, well, where do we go? Where do we start to do our own research and to gather data and to see how what does the research say? So there's a document in Appendix C that I want to be able to show everyone so that you'll be able to know what it looks like. Appendix C is selected tools and resources. So for example, if you've chosen the data committee, within your assignment, you will list, you may decide to list, okay, by the numbers, which is the second resource, by the numbers, a race for results, a case study using disaggregated data to inform policies, practices, and decision-making. And the KCE, the Annie E. Casey Foundation is the one who pulled together this data. And then you'll go to the second column where it says, it explains what is the purpose of this publication. Well, this publication is the second installment in the Race for Results case study series, and then you'll go from there. Let's go back to our PowerPoint. We're almost done here. So as you know, I am on the fundraising committee, and I've actually chosen the resource, the Annie Casey Foundation Report on Grant Making with a Racial Equity Lens. And within this guide, it explores how a racial equity lens can develop new leaders, encourage innovative approaches, and get people talking and inspire change inside foundations. So this could be a good resource for the foundation committee. And then the second resource that I chose was the article on how donor centrism can potentially perpetuate inequities. And I chose this because the author of this piece speaks about the pervasiveness of the donor-centered approach model in the nonprofit sector and how it may be perpetuating the very inequity that we are seeking to address as a sector. Now, here's the end goal. By challenging practices based on racism, sexism, and other historical and current forms of discrimination, we can create more inclusive communities and equitable outcomes. So this is the end goal for your service on the Equity and Inclusion Task Force. And whatever committee you selected out of those 6 levers, this is our end goal here. Now let's go to the actual assignments that corresponds with what we're trying to do here as well. Here's your assignment related to United Way's equity framework. The scenario is, as we stated before, congratulations, you volunteered to serve on an equity and inclusion task force for 1 year. Next, you've elected to serve on one of 6 committees, similarly outlined in United Way's 6 equity levers for success. United Way wants to tackle 3 domains: health equity, educational equity, and economic mobility for all. Using pages 106 through 122 in the United Way Equity Framework document in 500 words or less, I want you to submit an assignment that discusses, number 1, which domain would you focus on and why? Number 2, which equity lever or committee would you choose to serve on to address your selected domain, and tell us why? Number 3, I want you to list 2 general equity questions that your equity and inclusion team should prioritize to address your domain. Number 4, I want you to list at least 1 equity question that's specific to the committee that you chose within your domain. And number 5, list 2 discussion questions that you feel as though your committee should answer specific to your chosen equity lever or committee. Number 6, list 2 helpful tools and resources listed under your committee that should be researched to begin addressing your specific domain. You should complete this assignment within Moodle. You can either upload the document or you can actually submit it within Moodle itself, and it's due September the 12th. So that's the assignment for this week. If you have any questions about it, you can always email me, and I will be more than happy to provide more clarification. I want you all to have a great week. Thank you so much for tuning in.